Well, good day, everyone. My name is Chris Jonas. I'm the Director of Communications at the National Association for Business Economics. We're pleased to present today's event, which is the first session of the 17th Annual NABE Foundation Economic Measurement Seminar. We're going to go straight into today's program. It's my pleasure to introduce former NABE Foundation Chair Maurine Haver, President of Haver Analytics. Maurine, I'll turn it over to you.
Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. The first NABE Economic Measurement Seminar was held in Kissimmee, Florida, 16 years ago. And at that time, it was the idea to provide an informal atmosphere to bring data producers and data users together, particularly for the benefit of young economists who needed to learn more about the economic statistics. And to start that seminar, it was decided someone should give an overview. And so I've been doing it. Now this is the 16th year. And this year, of course, it's a bit different. We're going virtual. And so we will be hitting the highlights of the overview. So you don't have to watch me talk for an hour on this subject. Instead, we're going to focus on the key indicators that are important on track A for people taking the Certified Business Economist exam. This particular EMS has become a critical part of preparing for the exam. We're also going to give you a preview of sort of how the EMS works in terms of conversation. So I have with me today Mike Horrigan, president of the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Mike, before he joined the Institute about a year ago, he spent 30 years at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and he ran both the prices and employment programs. Also joining us is past NABE Chairman President Jack Kleinhenz. He's also co-chair of the EMS Planning Committee. Mike is chief economist. Sorry, Jack. Jack is chief economist of the National Retail Federation, and he heads his own economic consulting and wealth management firm. He has 40 years of broad-based working experience in organizations like the Cleveland Fed. And in his spare time, he is on the faculty at Case Western Reserve University and John Carroll University. And finally, Dana Saporta, who has over 30 years of experience analyzing the US economy and serving as a Fed watcher for firms like Citigroup and Stone and McCarthy. Before she retired last year from Credit Suisse, Dana had a role of designing recession scenarios as part of the bank's risk management team. So all three are CBEs. I think probably more than 100 years of experience among the three. So good people to talk about these data as well. So I'm going to start off here just giving you an overview of the federal statistical system. In the US government, we have over 100 agencies who have a line item in their budget for statistics. And there are 13 of those who are designated as principal statistical agencies. We're going to focus on three: the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And because it creates so much data, we're also going to include the Federal Reserve Board and actually in Track B, some data from Federal Reserve banks as well. In planning the EMS, we've divided the data into particular buckets. And I've just put in front of you here the various categories of data that we're thinking about when we plan the seminar. And of course, we start with employment. Employment figures actually come from all three statistical agencies, Census, BEA, and BLS. But it's the BLS that releases the employment situation the first Friday of every month. This release provides two measures of employment: the survey of households and the survey of establishments. No one should attend the EMS without coming away with an understanding that it's important to not intermix these data. The two surveys have very different objectives. The household survey gives us the unemployment rate. The establishment survey gives us jobs created, also earnings and hours worked. And as I said before, they provide two different definitions. On this graph, I'm showing household employment versus payroll. You'll see that households a lot higher. This is because it includes the unemployed, family workers, and people on unpaid leave. It does not include people on furlough. And this is an important point to understand if you're looking at the April through June household data. Payroll actually is a measure of jobs, not people. So if a person has two jobs, they could be in the payroll data twice. It's rare for me to put up a chart with old data, but I'm doing that here because I want to make the point about the volatility of the two different surveys and the fact that the two surveys in any given month can tell a different story. You might have a month, and you can see it here in 2018, where actually payroll jobs went up when household employment went down. You will also notice that household employment is much more volatile in terms of rate of change. And that's simply because it's a much smaller sample relative to its universe. There are also a lot of other employment programs. I've listed 4 here that we will include in the EMS. The Census of Employment and Wages, which is used to benchmark employment, payroll employment, the BED program, and JOLTS, all from BLS. And then finally, claims, of which we've been hearing a lot about recently. Claims do not come from the BLS. They are produced by the Department of Labor, however. Mike, you ran employment for many years at BLS. What advice do you have for new users of these data?
Well, one of the things I often tell people is that the unemployment rate is just one indicator. By itself, it doesn't tell you what's going on in the labor market. You have to look at a variety of indicators. And this is one of the things that will happen in the EMS, is you'll learn a lot about these various indicators. For example, what does it mean to be part-time for economic reasons? There's this thing called U1 through U6, which is alternative measures of labor utilization. The official unemployment rate is U3, but there's 6 alternative measures. Particularly right now in the COVID environments, with so many people being laid off, some people are being classified as unemployed because they're on layoff, but they're expecting recall. Other folks are really more near unemployed. They're out of the labor force. They're marginally attached. And understanding what those terms mean is really important. On the payroll side, it's similar. The payroll survey is really important from a variety of perspectives. It's a key macro indicator. It's a coincident indicator. It moves with the beginning and ends of recessions. It's a rich descriptor of what's happening in industries, industry employment. But there's things about the payroll employment that you need to understand that differentiate it from, as you mentioned in your comments, that differentiate it from the payroll survey. For example, it does not include the self-employed. And anyone looking at sort of data now know that we've included a lot of the self-employed workers in unemployment compensation. As you said, it's a count of jobs, not workers. But also, I think an important lesson that we always try to convey at the Bureau, especially to policymakers, is that 1 month does not a trend make. You oftentimes need to look at data over a longer period of time.
Thanks, Mike. So let's go on to national accounts. Another really important data set. And the BEA actually sort of sits in the middle. It brings together data collected from many parts of the government and also the private sector to produce gross domestic product and gross domestic income. As a part of that effort, consumption, of course, is very important, and BEA develops rich detail of monthly personal consumption expenditures. The monthly PCE is part of the monthly personal income release, which also gives us the personal savings rate. BEA calculates quarterly corporate profits, and we will have a special session on corporate profits at the EMS. Most countries of the world, or at least I should say many, build up their GDP from the industry side. The US has always built up GDP from the expenditure side. And for many years, the industry accounts lagged and were annual and got very little attention. Recently, the BEA has developed a very complete integrated set of industry accounts that are now also integrated with the expenditure side. And they are very timely. In fact, sometime in the not so distant future, we should have GDP by expenditure and GDP by industry coming out essentially at the same time. The Bureau also produces personal income down to the state and local area level. They have quarterly data for the states, annual data for counties and metro areas. And in addition, gross domestic product, gross product, I guess I should call it gross state product, also for the state, metro, and county level. On this chart, I have contributions to growth in real GDP. Now, when I went to undergraduate school and studied economics, we learned C plus I plus G plus X minus M equals GDP. And that was true in nominal or real terms. Today, we have chain GDP. With chain GDP, the data are not additive, except in the reference year. So you cannot do simple arithmetic. Contributions are much more complicated to calculate. And so BEA actually presents contributions for all of us data users so that we don't need to do the work. So you'll see on this chart, the line is the growth rate in real GDP. In a quarter, when the growth rate and the contributions are all positive, you'll actually see the top of the bar is exactly where the growth rate of real GDP meets the bars. When you have negative contributions, it will vary. Jack, I know as chief economist of the National Retail Federation, you follow GDP, you particularly follow consumption. And I've talked a bit about the rich detail of the personal, monthly personal consumption expenditures. What do you really look at in the NIPAs?
Well, thanks, Maureen. We all recognize that the consumer is a key part of the economy, so-called 2/3 of the economy. There is terrific detail that the Bureau of Economic Analysis provides. Unfortunately, the quarterly data is quarterly. And what I do look at very closely is the monthly data, the monthly expenditures and outlays data that you already mentioned. And there's a great deal of detail on the expenditures, as you mentioned. Now, that data is actually part and parcel coming from the Census Bureau, who generates the monthly advanced retail sales survey. And the retail sales survey is really my key data that we look at very, very closely from various sectors. And that's issued about 15 days after the close of the month. And once that is available and then processed, it then also becomes available to the BEA, which will take selected data from the retail sales and will be a part of the consumer expenditures consumption information that is available on a monthly basis. And so really very dependent on the data. Of course, there's lots of other data there, but I would say that the BEA and its data becomes really sort of the gold standard for us to look at how the economy is doing from a retail standpoint.
I know you're really excited about this new session that we have on the consumer sector. Do you want to tell us about that?
Well, I am, because I think what we have done in the past with the seminar is really focused on a lot of very high-level macroeconomic concepts. And let's just mention that, again, the consumer is a key factor, and we haven't had the opportunity to drill down and provide other information. And so this year, we are introducing a session that is looking more at data that's provided through the Bureau of Labor Statistics annual consumer expenditure survey. And for people who are listening, that is provided and is used for a computation for the CPI, but it also provides you what portion of spending is going on by different household spending categories. And then on top of that, we are also introducing the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances. Now that comes out every 3 years, and it provides us data on income, wealth distribution, asset ownership. But this year, there was a special supplemental survey that occurred in April 2020 because of the COVID. So with those two different surveys, we're going to get some new looks at how to understand the consumer in the economy.
Thank you. Okay, well, we have to move along here because we have a lot of topics. And the next important topic is really prices. Prices were among the first economic concepts tracked by governments. We hear stories of, like, Benjamin Franklin recorded the prices of various crops in Philadelphia before there was a United States. So prices of corn, wheat, cotton, and so on go back a long time. We have the price of oil, West Texas Intermediate crude oil, back to when it was first pumped in 1912. And the Consumer Price Index at the BLS actually goes back to 1913. Almost every department in the government collects some price data. But we're going to focus on prices from BLS and BEA. Except for housing, the census really focuses on quantities or nominal values. Several of the price programs are found in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And maybe Mike can tell us how that happened. I'm not sure. Anyway, we have the Consumer Price Index Program, producer prices, the Employment Cost Index, and import and export price indexes. And then, of course, coming out of the national accounts, we have the GDP price indexes. There are many versions of the CPI. It seems we talk about the CPI, but if you really look at the CPI program, we have the All Urban Consumers, the CPI-U, which is the headline measure on the monthly release. We also have the urban wage earners and clerical workers, the CPI-W. This index is very important because it indexes Social Security benefits and tax brackets, as well as serving as an escalator in many contracts. The Chained Consumer Price Index, the CPI-U, is actually a more recent creation of the BLS, and it follows chained measures similar to the GDP price programs. A little known program, but it's one of my favorites, is the CPI-URS, the research series. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Then we also have the CPI for older Americans, CPI-E. I guess they were called elderly when it was created. And finally, the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, the US HICP, which actually is comparable to the HICP produced for every EU member country. Here I've graphed the CPI-URS, which actually starts in 1977. against the CPI-U, which I've re-indexed to December 1977, equal 100. You will notice the increasing gap between the two in terms of the index levels. And really, by the end point here, there's almost a 10 percentage point gap between the two. The CPI-URS incorporates all the changes that have been made in the CPI program over time in terms of definitions, of corrections for mistakes, changes in methodology, and so on. The CPI is never revised. The reason being it serves as an escalator. So unless a mistake is found in the current calendar year, that mistake remains with us forever. Mike is smiling, yes. Also, when I started attending BLS advisory committee meetings, we didn't talk about the CPI as a cost of living index. We talked about it as simply a consumer price measure. And so over time, as consumer substitution between higher and lower priced products got incorporated via the geometric mean, that also influenced the levels of our CPI. Finally, I'd like to say a few things about the personal consumption expenditure chain price index. It has really become the inflation measure that many watch simply because the Fed has selected it for its target. And there are some problems of comparability with the CPI. First of all, the CPI, as I said, is never revised, but the PCE is revised over and over and over again. We get several revisions to PCE over time. The two indexes also have very different composition for particular categories such as housing and medical care. It's really the market-based PCE chain price index and the CPI-U, the chain CPI, that are the most comparable. They both are chained, they're both revised, and they have no imputations. Here I've graphed the two indexes, and you can see over certain periods of time, they really move very closely together. Then the CPI actually accelerated much more quickly for many years going. And I just noticed with the very recent data, they have now come back into alignment. Mike, you headed up BLS price programs for many years. And I said a few things about the CPI and consumer substitution. I didn't really talk about quality change, new products, other factors that some people say the CPI doesn't do such a good job in taking care of. I'm wondering what rises to the top for you in terms of your concerns.
Sure, and I will address the history of the CPI that you asked about before, but in terms of, you mentioned a lot of really important issues. I think quality change is one of the most important. If the price of a good goes up, but part of that price increase is quality change, that's not inflation. And so it's really critical that the Bureau of Labor Statistics figures out how much of a price increase should be attributed to quality and how much to just pure inflation. Now, when you're talking about, say, the speed of goods at which goods are introduced to the market, that can be an issue in terms of just keeping up with the changes that are going on in a dynamic economy. But I think really the biggest issue is the fact that it's very complex in some cases to measure quality change. If you think about, say, automobiles, every year you have new models. You can actually physically look at the changes that were put into an automobile. And there it's actually very possible, and the Bureau does a very nice job of capturing quality change. But if you think about services, and we're really becoming more of a service providing economy, the quality of change in the services that are provided in an economy is a very difficult concept to measure. So for example, what's the quality of hospital care? What's the quality of medical care? But unless you get that right, then estimates of the inflation, how much does medical care cost, and how much is inflation occurring in medical care, whether or any other area of service providing, such as say business services, for example, it's critical that we get it right. So that to me is really kind of a big issue. Another aspect though of quality is just the complexity of doing it. For a long time, the Bureau would send data collectors, and they still do, into stores to write out the characteristics of goods and see how they've changed. Well, what the Bureau is doing now increasingly is also things like web scraping, looking at websites. So for example, you can get a lot of information about the quality of products from the postings by firms on their websites, and you can web scrape those down. So there's a session on Tuesday, I think it's at 10, I believe, where it's talking about the use of private and corporate data in the formal statistical system. And that partnership is becoming important. In answer to your previous question about the history of the CPI, I'll be brief, but in around 1917 to 1919, there was a lot of concern about price increases in industries, in particular in shipbuilding. And so there was a series of studies conducted by the Bureau in industrial wage centers to look at basically the increases in prices and what that would mean to wage increases through negotiated kinds of contracts. And when the Bureau put those data out, they actually put the indexes out back to 1913. So the origins of this was actually industrial based, and then it expanded to be more of an economy-wide price index. And especially during World War II, there was a lot of concern about the impact of changing prices.
Thank you. Actually, I have discovered every EMS, and I've sat now through 15 of them. I learned something I didn't know each time.
I'm happy to provide that.
Okay, on to productivity. The BLS, again, takes its hours work data and combines it with output, which starts at the Census Bureau, as Jack mentioned, and then gets put in real terms by the BEA. And that all comes together to help us calculate labor productivity. And in the productivity and costs release, the BLS puts out quarterly measures for business, non-farm business, manufacturing, and the non-financial corporate sectors. It also, on that release, includes data on compensation and unit labor costs. Here I've graphed output per hour, in other words, productivity in the non-farm business sector, starting from 1995 through the present. Dana, I remember sometime, I guess it must have been last year, When over lunch you were telling this story about Alan Greenspan in the mid-1990s, saying, well, that he had this special insight on the economy based on what he was seeing in the productivity data. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, sure. In the mid-90s, Greenspan had what I would call almost an epiphany on productivity. He saw that companies were incorporating the newest technologies like personal computers into their daily operations, and he recognized the beginnings of what would become a historic increase in productivity in the second half of that decade. And because inflation risk is lower when productivity is booming, he led the FOMC to start easing policy about 25 years ago this month, in July 1995. They were trying to engineer a soft landing from the strong growth before. And looking back today, Alan Greenspan has said that soft landing of 1995 is the Fed's proudest accomplishment in his tenure.
Wow. Okay. Well, he certainly thought productivity was very important, but he must have understood some of the problems that we have with these data, right?
No, absolutely. Greenspan would be one of the first people to tell you that productivity is notoriously difficult to measure, and some of the revisions are epic. So you really have to approach these data with caution.
Okay. Well, moving on to international. And when we use the term international at the EMS, we're really talking about the foreign or external sector of the United States. Occasionally, we have done a session on international comparisons, comparing data across countries. But on the track A, the international session focuses primarily on international trade and also our balance of payments. The monthly international trade in goods and services is really a joint effort of the Census Bureau and the BEA. Census is responsible for goods. They process the forms that are collected by the Customs Bureau. The BEA is responsible for services. We have lots of detail on trade in goods. You can get trade by country, by world area, by end use, by SITC, by harmonized system, by NAICS product codes, also trade between parents and their foreign affiliates. And in fact, just recently, Census put out a special release that is just putting out the data subject to our current agreement with China. The BEA actually produces the balance of payments data. And they are reported in something called the Summary of International Transactions, which comes out quarterly. This release presents the current account and also the financial account of the United States, once upon a time known as the capital account. And now the capital account is a very tiny little fraction of these statistics. BEA also produces the international investment position of the United States, and they have a very innovative program that puts out direct investment of multinational corporations, both in the United States and outside the United States. Here I've graphed the current account balance as a percent of GDP. I like this chart because it shows that we actually can be in balance. We've we've really not had a balance on current account, except for when the economy was in recession since the 1960s. So my entire career, our international trade and also current account balance has been in deficit. So talking about trade, if it had been last December, we would have been talking about the US-China trade war. But now what's on everybody's mind, well, we know, the pandemic. We've learned all about the PPE and swabs that we need only come from China. And, you know, you read in a lot of publications that manufacturing is going to come back to the United States. And we know where Trump stands on this, and Biden's economic plan also focuses on restoring innovation and production in the US. But politics aside, what do you see as the true underlying trends with respect to globalization? Anyone? Dana?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about what San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly's been saying recently on the subject. She said that companies doing business in China weren't waiting around for the end of the trade negotiations or trade war, you know, whoever you speak to. They were getting started early, looking at where else they needed to establish supply chains. It wasn't enough just to find the lowest cost producer and not have any duplication. These days they're taking more of a portfolio approach. They're not necessarily exiting China, but they're looking for other countries to supplement their supply chain, because I guess the mantra is a diverse supply chain is a healthy supply chain. So that's going on, but what Delhi is not hearing necessarily is lots of plans to reshore production back to the US. Rather, companies are looking elsewhere on the globe. So it's not that reshoring is not happening. It just, as for now, it doesn't appear to have makings of a major trend.
Okay, thank you.
Maurine?
Yeah.
Could I wanted to add one quick perspective. Totally in agreement with what Dana said, but I thought of this example because it strikes me as one of the things I love about the EMS and about NABE in general, is that you get to talk to people who know these data, like the international data, but then you also get the business economist perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember this one conversation I had a couple of years ago where they were talking about globalization, but from the point of view of the kind of purchases that companies make, direct buys versus indirect buys. And one of the things that was sort of the point that was being made was that with things like direct buys, where you're getting raw materials, there's not a lot of loyalty. You know, you go for the lowest price and you go wherever you can get it, whether it be back here in the US or be it somewhere else, whether that be oil or, you know, whatever the raw material is. But with indirect buys, and I think this has an impact on globalization, you develop these sort of longer term relationships to try to maintain those relationships. And I think that portfolio approach that Dana mentioned is a good example of where you create these relationships and you're not necessarily going to abandon them right away, even though there does seem to be this little bit of a trend back to the US. So again, it just having the opportunity to talk to business economists at an event like this in conjunction with the data that we're also talking about is usually, it's quite a unique part of the EMS.
Very good point. Thank you, Mike. All right, so financial. This is such a broad category of data, just coming from many public and private sources. So with the EMS, we clearly have to shrink it down. And so we're really focusing in the EMS primarily on data coming from the Federal Reserve Board. And even there's so much data. They have interest rates, exchange rates, data on money, banking, and credit, the Fed's balance sheet, the H41, and then these really growing financial accounts. We started with flow of funds, with just sources and uses of funds, and then over time they added the balance sheets. And now we have the financial accounts, which is really this broad set of data where we have the integrated macro accounts where BEA and the Fed are really putting together the macro side with the balance sheets of businesses and households. We have the distributional financial accounts that just came out, I think this year, well, I mean, within the last 12 months, the enhanced financial accounts, just a really big data set that answer questions about household net worth, the distribution of wealth by age, education, race. That's from the new distributional financial accounts. Also, you can get at the financing gap. I've just done a couple of graphs here. The first is mortgages as a percent of total household debt. And you'll see that, you know, starting in 2001, how mortgage debt really went up quite significantly, peaking in the financial crisis. But now how recently it has come down very significantly in this expansion. Well, the past expansion. Also, here's just another look at household net worth. And again, we can see the steady increase in net worth of households, except primarily for periods of recession, where actually the 2001 period, we didn't see a setback. It actually, despite the drop in the stock market. So the first significant decline we see is with the great financial crisis. Dana, I know you have followed these accounts really closely. And I'm just wondering what might be your top 3 statistics that, you know, you always look at, because as I said, there's just so much there.
Yeah, it's hard to choose just 3. It's such a massive report, but I suppose the first number I would always go to is what you have right there, household net worth. In fact, the details of that number make for a lot of good stories. For example, during the great financial crisis, home prices fell a lot. And so did stock prices, but home prices even more. And on the way up, it took much longer for housing values to come back than equity values. And if you think about it, that actually exacerbated the wealth gap that was already in the economy, because to the extent that middle income and lower income households have some wealth they're holding, it's usually tied up in their homes. So that's one reason I like looking at these data, to look at those breakdowns. I think I'd say a second statistic I often monitor is just plain net debt issuance, either at the aggregate level, or you can slice and dice in so many ways, non-financial, financial, federal, state, and local. We know one category that is absolutely booming right now is US Treasuries, because sovereign debt issuance has been big to help support households and businesses during the COVID crisis. It'll be interesting when the Q2 data come out to compare the public and private debt issuance. We should be getting those data in late September. And the third indicator, I'm going to go with the financing gap. There we just take capital outlays and we look at internally generated funds by usually non-financial businesses and see if they're generating enough cash to meet their expenses. If not, obviously there's the gap that needs to be financed. This could be overwhelming, this report, but the good news is There is one session dedicated to the financial accounts at the EMS, and that will be on the last day of the seminar on September 2nd.
Okay. Jack, with claims rising, they keep increasing week after week. How concerned are you about the balance sheet of the U.S. consumer?
Well, let me just back up a moment. Looking at your previous chart and data that Dana just talked about, the household balance sheet in the aggregate was in very good shape before this recession. Now, total debt did increase. In fact, it was a record high fourth quarter, $14.2 trillion. Most of it was mortgage debt. But rather than make an assessment of the state of the consumer, I think it's important that maybe we just identify some indicators that are available for people to use or at least focus on when they think about how the consumer is. And first of all, let's just start with monthly data. Back to your comment about the Federal Reserve Board, it's a great first start. The Consumer Credit G19 report, which will come out on August 7th. So next week we'll learn a little bit more about how consumers are using credit for loans for their household and how they finance their purchases of goods and services. And of course, there's two categories to watch there, and that is the revolving and non-revolving. Revolving is mostly credit card. And from an interpretation standpoint, a slowdown or an acceleration in the growth of consumer credit outstanding is an indicator of consumer condition. So when you see a rapid growth, it means that households are perhaps more willing and able to buy consumer goods. Now, at the same time, there's an argument that has been made that they may also, during times of recession, needing to turn to revolving credit to fill the gap between their income and their credit needs. But that's probably not the case right now, given the fact that there is the federal stimulus, and that is actually the data from the federal stimulus and relief funds have influenced the behavior of consumers, and the data at this point probably doesn't really fully reflect the potential effect of the COVID-19. So you've got the revolving and non-revolving debt, and then you also have on a quarterly basis that we get data from on household debt from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, for most customers, payments are more important than the level of debt. And when you assess a purchase, most consumers think about, does their income fit the payment? And so there are two different ratios using the household debt and income data from the BEA. You can find this through the Federal Reserve Board, and this is quarterly data, the financial obligations ratio. It looks at your debt payments as a percentage of your total disposable income. And then you also have what they call the household financial obligation, which is another way of looking at spending of consumers' ability to pay their debts on average. And again, I would argue that we're going to have to watch this closely because of the CARES Act, which allows for forbearance for different types of loans. And so this data may be out of kilter with its trend. And of course, with unemployment insurance and benefits, we're going to have to be watching also how that is affecting getting back to work and how fast people might be able to pick up where they left off.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, last category, business cycle indicators and surveys. Many of these provided by both the private sector and many from Federal Reserve banks. And actually, we have a session each year, 3 Federal Reserve district banks present on some of their special work. We also have the purchasing managers surveys, and now, in fact, Market is providing a flash survey on the PMI, consumer attitude surveys from the University of Michigan and the Conference Board, And then many employment and business confidence measures. And during this time of pandemic, there are all these new data sets coming out from the private sector, organizations that have never produced data for consumption before, like Open Table and Homebase and so on. So there's just a lot going on in this area. But I'd like to focus instead on the business cycle aspect. And I have the graph here of the composite index of 4 coincident indicators. Now, this started at the Department of Commerce with a publication called Business Cycle Digest. And it was taken over by the Conference Board in the mid-90s. And I've just put up the composite coincident index, which should align with business cycles. And it is composed of the monthly employment, payroll employment, personal income excluding transfer payments, industrial production, and business sales. That's the total sales coming on the MTIS report. So in other words, manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers sales. And you will see I have recession shading here, how actually this does do a very good job of tracking economic activity. And of course, the very significant drop that we've just seen recently, which in fact led the National Bureau of Economic Research, the organization that actually designates the start and end of recessions. They did say the economy reached a peak in February. And that was announced on, I think it was June 8th. Mike, this is really the fastest recession call I think they've ever made. In fact, I sent a note to Jim Paterba, who runs NBER, and I said, thank you for making this call. And I got this note quickly back saying, this has to be the first time we've been thanked for calling a recession. But, you know, for people like me, it matters. What has been their history of making recession calls?
Well, so a couple points just to emphasize to the group listening. You know, NBER is not a government organization. It's semi-private. It's composed. There's a business cycle dating committee that has various team macroeconomists sitting on it, and they generally deliberate. I mean, part of what I think the message that you were sending throughout this entire presentation is that data get revised. So something that comes out today may get revised next year simply because we don't do a universe update for a year. There may be revisions that come in terms of late reports. There's a lot of different reasons that you'll learn at the EMS as to why data are not necessarily going to be the same. Unlike CPI, which doesn't get revised, most data series do get revised over time. And because of that, the NBR generally takes a slow and cautious sort of look at where the economy is going with respect to the revised data. This particular recession call was one where it just was unmistakable. It was deep, it was quick. We don't know how long it's going to last, but certainly this was the quickest. But one good example is in 1991, we had a recession. And the NBER called the recession the year after the recession actually ended. So it was that long after before they actually called that the recession had begun. Because their interest is not in making news today. Their interest is in getting it right and dating it correctly. But the fact that they called it in June, that a recession began in February, is just testimony to the fact that even with revised data, the economy went into a downfall, a spiraling into a downfall very quickly between February and March.
Let me follow up on that a little bit, Mike, as you were mentioning. Historically, it takes a while for the economy to get to the point where we reach a recession. I mean, they're looking at basically 4 key measures. It's employment, personal income, as we have industrial production, and also the sales, manufacturing, retail trade. But not all those are falling at the same pace and at the same rate. So that's one explanation why it's been delayed, and one of the reasons why it was so very clear this time around that there was a complete stopping or a fall off. And there's a kind of a rule of thumb out there that 2 consecutive quarters are a good signal of a recession, but the NBR doesn't use that signal or use that rule. In many ways, you could have some soft quarters, but it doesn't really qualify for a depth that's required for a recession. So I think it's a matter of interpretation of the data by this committee. And just as a reminder, just as people are thinking about what's an expansion, what's a recovery, a peak marks the end of an expansion, the beginning of a recession, and a trough marks the end of the recession and begins the expansion. So it's a function of looking at the data, and the GDP number. Why not use that? It's largely because you mentioned it can be revised, and it is got delays in terms of the information that it can provide.
And just as a final quick comment to bring this kind of full circle, we started the whole EMS discussion today with employment, unemployment. A lot of this is art as well as science, in the sense that measurement is difficult. Measurement can be very challenging. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics have noted in the last several months that the measure of unemployment is probably underestimating the true unemployment that's out there because of a problem they had with measuring people as employed but absent from work rather than being unemployed. So I think one of the benefits of the EMS is that you get not only the inside story, but you get a sense of appreciation for how complex these measurement issues can be.
And actually, in that employment session, I really hope to dig into that, because at first, I was on the side of the people that said, well, if they know it's underestimated, why don't they fix it? And I then looked into it, and now I understand why what they said was correct. But we don't have time to talk about all that today, but we will get into it at the EMS. And Jack, thank you so much for mentioning a recession is not defined by 2 negative quarters. Too many people believe that. Anyway, this presentation is only the beginning. We have more coming with the EMS this year. And so first is the seasonal adjustment webinar that we'll hold on August 27th. And then the economic measurement seminar itself, which will begin on August 31st, and will take 3 days instead of 2 days in virtual mode. And we're excited. We have Loretta Mester, president of the Cleveland Fed, and Jim Perturba, president of the NBR, as 2 of our featured speakers. And then to top it all off, we are going to end with a panel discussion of leaders from Census, BEA, and BLS. So we're going to have those people who run the agencies that we spent 3 days investigating their data and learning about it. They're going to close the EMS on September 2nd in the afternoon, discussing the challenges facing the agencies. So we really do hope that many of you will attend this year's EMS. And I think actually Chris Jonas has a few words on how you can register and actually get a scholarship, for this year's EMS. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Maureen. I want to thank everyone for attending today. We received a number of good questions in the Q&A box. We'll share those with the panelists, and they've agreed to follow up by email. Just one more reminder, if you haven't registered yet, the 17th Annual NABE Foundation Economic Measurement Seminar will take place August 31st to September 2nd. And note that the early bird deadline is next week, Wednesday, August 5th. We do have a number of scholarships available, as Maureen mentioned, through the NABE Foundation, and there's more information on how to apply for a scholarship on the EMS website. We did send out a link as well to the full program in the chat box, as well as a link to today's slide presentation. Just as a reminder as well, the recordings of past NABE webinars are available through the NABE Connect app, which can be downloaded at the App Store and through Google Play. NABE members can also access webinar recordings and handouts through the NABE.com digital archive. If you're not a member of NABE and are interested in joining, please go to NABE.com/join for more information. Thank you all again for participating in today's webinar, which is copyright 2020 by the National Association for Business Economics with all rights reserved. This does conclude the event. Thank you all. You may now disconnect.